Hello and welcome to another episode of Exchanges with me, Evan Lucas. What an episode I get to bring to you today. A guest that needs no introduction, the one and only Paul Zahra, an absolute doyen in the retail sales space, has been doing this kind of work for over 30 years. His exposure as CEO at David Jones, he was also the chief executive at the ARA, makes him the absolutely perfect person to get on right now with where retail is going, particularly in the digital world and the rise of AI. So without any further ado, here is this week's Exchanges with Paul Zahra. Paul Zahra, welcome to Exchanges. It's a perfect time to have somebody of your ilk in this space. We have just seen changes in this country around the household and household consumption. First and foremost, it's also probably pointed to go back over the last 5 years. We've just gone through an incredible period with COVID and the post-COVID spending period. How have you managed the retail space? Because we went from a scenario where bricks and mortar had some pretty rocky periods. Omni-channels have gone through the roof. You know, we're now getting back to bricks and mortar, but experiences. Take me through what particularly you have seen over the last 5 years, but also in your 20 years plus experience in retail that is really defining what you're now seeing as the future of retail.
Well, Evan, great to be here. We go back 20 years. This might be more than a 30-minute podcast, but I'll do my best to be succinct. But really lovely to be here talking to you today. So look, the way I would term the last 5 years, I'd call, and I've said this before, it's been a permanent state of disruption for retailers. So from the pandemic to digitization to the local uncertainty to the geopolitical environment, the uncertainty globally, and the rise of AI. So the retailers have had to really juggle many things to not to thrive at the moment. It's really survival for many of them, and you've heard lots of closures in that middle market, which we'll talk about shortly. But there's a lot of retailers under significant pressure.
So the one thing that I was fascinated about in my world from behavioral economics was adaptation, was just how fast businesses had to adapt because of COVID and where it went and where they are now at with that adaptation. I want to go to first, let's go to the big elephant in the room, which is AI, right? So there's a lot of talk at the moment about retailers with pricing, retailers with the ability to adapt. How is AI now putting that next level of upward pressure for those that can and the downward pressure for those that can't?
Well, like with any technological changes, there's winners and losers. So I think if you're a small business, you're under more pressure, and that's what we're seeing. Small business really struggling to try and keep across and understand not only the industrial relations requirements of running a shop, but in fact the technological requirements as consumers are becoming more and more demanding of retailers and actually having things quick and fast and being edited for them. So what AI does, and I'm really positive AI. I just completed this course because I wanted to be on the cutting edge of this change, because I do think it's a silver bullet for the industry in as much as saying it's got the ability to improve service and reduce cost. So and that's why I think the recovery in the retail industry was predominantly AI fueled. Now, to do that, you need to be able to do lots of research and development, and that's fairly new technology, even though there's a massive acceleration in AI. We're still trying to get our heads around it. But the reality is, whilst there might be some privacy concerns, AI can do about 80% of what a human can do in most cases, particularly in the retail industry, from a back of house perspective and in serving customers online. And the other 20% obviously needs human reviews. So what we do think it's going to obviously is revolutionise the retail industry in a positive way.
I'm going to come back to something you mentioned before about particularly around IR laws, but I just want to pick up one more thing with the AI conversation, because I think this is absolutely poignant with where we're currently at. What you're basically suggesting is AI can do your product pricing, your product placement, your overall, consumer relation handling. Is this going to mean that also what we've been sort of seeing in the retail space is hospitality and retail are the one spaces that is still absolutely employ the most amount of people in this country, but are now facing a scenario where, a reasonable amount of that employment can be replaced by AI? Is that also the next step forward?
Well, look, I don't think so. I think again, I'll remain positive on AI because I think what will happen is it'll create different skills, require different skill sets, right? So I think there'll be always opportunities. It's the largest private employer in the country, 420 billion, 1.4 million people work in retail. That's 1 in 10 Australians. It's significant. So the skill set will change. And I think when you talk about referencing my 20 years or so experience, I mean, this is the whole thing in summary. When I grew up in the world of retail, it was very much about emotional intelligence and that sort of that connection with the customer and actually intuitively making decisions. And of course, that EQ is important, but we've now gone to a really IQ and that hyper IQ of actually being able to not only assess customers' data and information and serve up to them things in a much more personalized way. When there's this now move into hyper personalization, but it's often the beauty about how it'll be telling customers what they want before they know what they want based on their past purchasing, and partly what we're doing online. Everything, all that data is being collected, and what AI is doing, it's training AI with more and more information. And that's why AI has really got this traction now because more and more of us are operating online just from doing searches, etc. So this massive data collection, and that's where what AI can produce is much more accurate than it's ever been.
Yeah, so that also is very interesting because you talk about, back in the day, the emotional IQ and having EQ in terms of that touch. There's an argument that also AI is going to improve that, as you said, with regards to having that relationship, knowing what your client already wants before they do, and then having the ability to reach out and touch, I think is a fascinating point. So that also, therefore, again, asks about pricing because
Mm.
there is a lot of question, particularly over the last 2.5 years, cost of living that we've been through and how that's moved. There's been finger pointing at retail, both staples and discretionary, about pricing. Can you counter that argument? Because I think it's pretty clear to be argued against, but there is this idea that pricing has been driven by business rather than driven by other factors.
Well, look, all in all, I'll say retailers to be sustainable are going to remain profitable, right? So, and as a result, they're going to use every tactic in the book to try and maximize their profit. That's what they're there for, is to serve customers, but at a profit. And I guess in the world now of AI and the fast moving technologies, that the algorithms are much more dynamic, so it can be able to do what we'd call localized pricing based on consumers' behavior, but equally times of the day when you're more likely to pay more if you're wanting something delivered, in the evening because you desperately need a particular ingredient to complete something you're cooking, or you've gotten home after a long day's work and you've realised your dog's there and you've got no food. So maybe in that pricing model there'll be more and more of that. It's not where I see AI as only function, of course. It goes across the whole industry, but it's one of the areas you could employ to get better pricing outcomes. So often, retailers can sell something at a discount that they could be selling at full price, and that's the information that AI will be able to, or at a less of a discount. So maximizing those margins become important. Now, in saying that, that's the AI bit, but the other bit around what you just touched on pricing is that as a former retail operator, those listening to this podcast would understand that, Australia is a very difficult place to do business as a retailer because we have a really low population. We're geographically widespread. We've got to serve, from the eastern states to the western states, and at a high cost to get product around. So, we don't have a resilient supply chain. We knew that when we sort of saw through COVID. COVID did many things. It showed how isolated we were, how the lack of resilience is the fact we didn't have a supply chain recovery plan, but it also accelerated trends in digitization and people working from home. So trends that were already occurring accelerated during that COVID period. And that has another area that retailers have had to adapt to quite significantly.
So I'm just going to jump in there because the other question, therefore, comes from supply chains is policy. And I know you're a very big advocate and have been in your former life with regards to what you were at the RAA. Supply chains were clearly a problem. What's your opinion then of things like the Future Made in Australia, or whether or not there needs to be more manufacturing brought back into this country to deal with supply chain issues that we saw through the pandemic?
Look, I can't speak for all categories. The issue again, referencing sadly in my second spot, the last 20 years,
Hmm.
is that we don't have a real manufacturing great track record. Now, Partly because I think the car industry was the last industry to fall over, and that's because we've got higher labour costs. Now, that's great for living conditions for Australians, not great for manufacturing. So manufacturings tend to go where the lowest price is. Now, I think about the future made in Australia. It's quite targeted. It seems to be on mostly on clean energy. I think that makes complete sense. So as long as those sorts of strategies don't mean that Australians are paying more, or there's a good balance between the jobs created and the price people are paying. Because if those costs of those goods end up being at a premium, and people are going to still buy product from China. So that's the
Yeah.
whole point. So I do think it's right that the government's got a strategy there. Time will tell whether it's been effective.
Yeah, and the other part that I would argue also with that is that they are selective choosing with regards to that manufacturing output, and that's probably a debate for another time. So, getting back to your other part of your answer previously around AI and the pressures that retail is going through, IR has to become part of the conversation as well, and it is a very charged question. We are about to lead into an election. The AI changes that have come about, particularly in the last 3 years, how much pressure have they put on the high street and how much pressure have they put on particularly medium-sized retail?
Significant pressure, and the smaller the business, the greater the pressure. Because what's occurred here, of course, I don't know if anyone's ever seen the General Retail Industry Award, but it's substantial. You need a law degree to be able to understand it. Now, the small business to get their head around that particularly is problematic, and that's why we have lots of issues. And the unions would say wage theft. I would argue most retailers do the right thing. Most do the right thing, but mostly it's through you know technological payroll systems that can't deal with the complexity of our IR systems, and that causes the issues. So, when you think about retailers, they want, we're reasonably simple people operating in a very complex world, and all this bureaucracy, red tape, that adds to the ability to serve customers and to get the pricing that we need to survive. And that's where it becomes difficult. In the last couple of years, we've seen more IR reform than we have in decades, and it's come as a tsunami, and as a result, many retailers are struggling. And as a result, there's whole in larger retailers, there's whole departments that manage the General Retail Industry Award just to make sure that things are done right. In a small business, of course, you've got resources online, but they're limited.
And not only that, what we've just discussed with regards to the changes of AI, because what I also therefore want to get your opinion on is when most of these laws were brought in, was the work week was the normal time, Monday through Friday, and then you have your additional works on Saturday and Sunday. That week, I would argue these days, is not the same. It is not seen as that. So, we are seeing more and more businesses, particularly in that small and medium retail space, give up Sundays. Is that also what needs to be addressed? Is how we approach, particularly the weekend and the way that the weekend is currently being charged?
Look, completely agree, because yes, the simple answer is yes, because retailers have to be open when customers want to shop. And customers predominantly, we're full employment at the moment, so most people are doing their shopping outside of, if not shopping online, they're doing their physical short store shopping in the evenings or on weekends. So we've got some of the most outrageously outdated trading hours legislation, because it's all state based in WA, Queensland, as good examples. Adelaide's in there as well. And there's that issue. Then the other issue is, of course, because consumers are shopping differently. We've got in the hospitality industry, you've got now hospitality restaurants sort of putting in a Sunday surcharge. Now, that's not that customer friendly, but they have to do that to survive. Now, retailers won't go down that path. They've got to absorb that cost. But sometimes you find that the staffing models in the smaller businesses less staffed appropriately on a Sunday because they can't afford the penalty rate. So that's where we have to sort of change the thinking. I'm not advocating that we remove penalty rates per se, but I'm saying that maybe there's an overall review that needs to happen on the rate that's being paid, but it should be the same rate across the board. The history back in the day was because it was protecting Sundays because of for religious reasons, so people could go to church. That was the union's argument at the time. Now, of course, that's a very different world when I'm not sure that you could argue in Australia that the majority of Australians are attending church on a Sunday. So there's all this sort of historic stuff union legacy stuff that sort of keeps regurgitated. And I think, we have to sort of overall, if we want the industry to thrive, then it has to be a case of all those barriers to success need to be addressed. And one of the biggest issue with the award is the fact that there's little flexibility. So you want be able to roster staff when customers are shopping. That's a simple, at a particular rate.
Yeah, and so I mean, history is always the problem with law because it just basically gets written on top of and on top of and top of. And I agree with you, particularly the Sunday rates are the fascinating one. Full disclosure, I worked in retail with my parents for over 15 years in Adelaide, and I understand what you're talking about with the 11 till 4 situation on a Sunday and how disadvantaged that probably would now be to consumers in Adelaide, along with obviously those that operate in that space in that city. I need to then come to the next thing that's happening about with all those complexities, with all of the AI, with all of the online scenarios, we are starting to see scenarios of basically the gorillas are now winning. So we look at an Amazon, you look at the duopolies that are coming on, and particularly in apparel retail, somewhere that you're very, very well versed in. How do we address what could end up being a scenario where we get to a point where the most efficient thing and the most productive thing is that the gorilla wins? What's the next step in that space? Because how do you compete with an Amazon? How do you compete with a big omni player out in that space? How do you compete with a Woolies and Coles with all that complexity that we now have?
Well, look, let's take the conversation around the multinationals because I think that's a really interesting. This globalization, you're not going to stop because it's this train ride that's going very, very fast, and we're sort of waiting to sort of see how that plays out. But Amazon's at $6 billion. Temu and Shein are, Temu and Shein. If you think about it, just 18 months, 2 years ago, no one knew who they were. They've come from nowhere. They're a $2 billion business. They're now taking more money than my former department store head at David Jones. Like who's built a brand over 185 odd years. So you sort of got to see what's happening, and then you've got this middle market here. So something like Catch, that's sort of Catch.com that competed with those online who've just gone
So just gone, right? So Wesfarmers have just let them go. So
let them go, absolutely. And then you've got this middle market of brands. So I think when you look at the customer, and it's a she, so most discretionary shopping is done by women. She's working to a budget. She's either mostly trading down, so going for the lowest, looking for low prices. So because she's trying to get her household budget to go well, and this is great divide happening where the middle market's being squeezed. So Mosaic Brands would be another good example. Those brands, Rivers, Katie's, etc. Now we're talking about thousands of jobs that have just gone to the wall as customers have changed their shopping behaviour. And these are national retailers. Ali Fashion's another good example that's just announced administration as well. So you've got this situation where customers are trading down and they're looking. She's busy. She's looking for convenience, and she's looking for the lowest price. So in that, you've got this completely changing mix of dynamics that's making this this customer, a very complex customer to try and get a hold on. And there's going to be winners and losers. So how do you compete with a multinational? I'd argue you can't. So you've got to find a different space, a clear space to play.
So the next interesting part of what you're talking about there is, have we built a consumer over the last several decades that now has that basically the mentality of constant change? Because one of the things that's thrown at the Australian consumer, particularly on apparel, is that we are one of the highest apparel consumers per annum. We're also one of the highest consumers for apparel waste in this country, in the world.
Yes.
What's the equilibrium here? How do we get past high level consumption at that low base cost with high turnover back to a placing of value on the quality of product that we build and therefore holding on to it for longer than we actually currently do?
Well, look, this is a really good question. And I think there's definitely lots of work being done in this space right now. But I think, if you think about, if I take a European example, they've introduced a fast fashion tax to try and actually slow that down.
Yep.
And that's an interesting model. I'm not sure whether you can assess, it's probably too early to assess whether that's working or not. But this is this sense of wanting, and I'd probably describe the current customer as being complex, but there's also this split personality because as a consumer, they're looking for sustainability and circular economy. And brands that play to their personal values on one hand, but then they're also happy to shop at Temu and Shein when it suits them, which are, allegedly, from a values point of view, there's been all sorts of accusations around modern slavery, etc. So,
Yeah.
when I think about it, you sort of got to then force the customer to be accountable, and then the retail. There's a whole re-education required, I think, re-educating or educating the customer, and also the retailer taking a sense of what we call stewardship around the product that they're selling, that they take it back and are able to repurpose, recycle, or reuse in some shape or fashion.
Because I know you're a big advocate for this. I know you're a very big advocate for particularly ESG and for consuming, sustainably. Is there regulation here? Is that the step in terms of getting that education, or is it, it has to go it alone by the industry to actually provide, Temu is a great example. The ethical considerations that are being pointed at them are fully real. Who has to own this space now?
Well, look, Tanya Plebiscik in her minister portfolio has come out. She's funded, the government's funded a group called Seamless, who are doing some great work. The team, they're outstanding. And part of the rationale here is that the industry has been set this opportunity to try and solve this issue around the circular economy, or the opportunity around the circular economy, but this issue around landfill. And what Tanya Plebiscik is saying is that if the industry can't solve it, then there'll be regulation to force it. Now, we really you probably need the regulation to force it, but you also need the industry to step up and actually say, we want to be part of something bigger and do the right thing. Because, if every retailer took a sense of stewardship for the product that they're selling, it also creates footfall because it brings customers back. Now, fashion, it's another conversation, has lots of complexity because if the fibers, there's no real solution right now for if it goes to an opportunity shop to sell. There's a huge growth in secondhand goods, whether that's in a charity or whether it's in the secondhand goods market. But if it goes to it goes to a landfill. That's the whole point. It doesn't go to a recycling spot because no one's really mastered that textile, being able to break down the textile to reuse it sufficiently. So there's some early technology. And of course, if it's 100% cotton or it's one particular fabric, it's easier to solve for. But if it's a mixture of fibers, then that becomes more problematic. So Seamless are doing a great job. They're in early stages, a way to go, but the retail community is mixed around how that's going to look going forward. And that's what we'll need to wait and see.
One of the things I always argue, and getting back to your point around Tanu Pliversek, is taxation is a great behaviour changer. I mean, we love to say it in a good and a bad light, but the tobacco fuel excise is a clear example of what you're talking about. So the next thing I also want to get your opinion on, and it is opinion, and I understand that, is we are seeing a rapidly changing movement, particularly around DEI and where that sits. I know, as I said to you, you're a very big advocate for this space, the changes that therefore filter through into ESG. How are we going to navigate this period? Because it is a very important part of our industry. It's a very important part of making sure that not just Australia, but the world moves to a more sustainable sort of footing. How are we going to deal with this change that is now happening from an administration overseas to deal with the change that we need to make internally to keep making sure we meet these targets?
Look, I think that what it's doing, it is concerning to see what's coming out of the US. There's no doubt about that, particularly from a diversity, equality, and inclusion perspective. I say that, this is protectionism at its worst.
Yep.
I think those companies that have come out and formally said they're going to adopt the Trump administration's view of D&I were never really genuinely committed to D&I because they can't have been to be able to move back that quickly. Now, we haven't seen that play out in Australia at this stage. I'm hoping that it won't. I think we're a much smaller population. I think we've got a very different culture, different government. When it comes to retail, I'm really clear. We serve a diverse community. The staff are a diverse community. So we have to be successful, we have to adopt diverse and equality and inclusion type policies because for us to thrive, we need to be able to do that. And we're not, we're a limited population. Every customer is a customer. So we've got to be able to make sure we leverage every particular customer be able to speak to all consumers. And hopefully AI will help in the world of hyper-personalization, give a much more edited aspect to the data that's collecting to be able to actually serve up better quality, marketing and inspiration.
Paul, I always finish these discussions with one big question, and that is, if you're in charge for one day, what would you do?
Well, look, it's a good question. Look, I probably want to do something that's going to have a lasting impact. That's probably the first thing I would say. So I think we talked about supply chain. I think living through COVID, I mean, I would appoint a minister for supply chain. I think the main focus would be around supply chain resilience. And I think we saw through COVID the lack of actual coordination. I don't think anyone knew how much power the states actually had through until we sort of lived through COVID. I think, but it's important to have both a national and global approach in addressing supply chain stresses. So, we have some of the most unproductive ports in the global infrastructure, and we are so far removed from everybody. When you think about the ministerial portfolios, you it's sort of shared across many. And I think government needs to be able to step in and support businesses and workers where the supply of essential goods and services, particularly, are at risk of disruption. So I think developing a more resilient, transparent, and diverse global supply chain. I think we talked about, achieving circular, and also net zero ambition. I think this role would be able to help those things along, but most importantly, with climate change, being able to deal with any sort of retail disaster response and, having a recovery framework will move the industry from being this sort of fragile, surviving industry that's continuing going through all these changes to something, an industry that thrives.
Yeah, reaction versus production. Paul Zahra, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on Exchanges. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
What a huge discussion to have with Paul at this point in time in the market. Clearly, as he points out very strongly, AI is going to be part and parcel of making sure that the consumer gets the best opportunity they can, and how retail needs to use it to expand their overall offering into a very digital future. Thank you so much to Paul for coming on. I absolutely love to have him on here. But as always, guys, please, this is all about you. If you've got questions, ideas, guests that you want to get on, please get on to exchanges@evanlucas.com.au. Send in those ideas. Also, please don't forget, subscribe wherever you're listening to this or watching it. Please get on there. The more and more subscribers I can get, the better guests and more guests I can get in. But once again, thank you to Paul and to you out there for listening, and I'll see you next week for Exchanges.